Hello, hello, hello.
Hello.
Bobby, how are you? Brian, how are you? Steve, how are you? A bunch of other folks are joining in. Good to see everybody. Steve, you are on mute if you're trying to share something with the group. I can't hear you. David is coming to us from the top of Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments ready to go. All right, so we're going to get started. Letting a few more people join us in the waiting room. Okay. Can folks see this shared slide? Yeah? Okay, good. Good. All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see all of you. I'm really looking forward to the next couple of weeks together. The story of Honi the Circlemaker is one that has so many levels to it. And we are going to go deep and we are going to go wide. Hopefully we won't get overrun with the floods of rain waters and make our way back out at a certain point along the way. But I'm just excited to be joining all of you and be joined by all of you and to begin the conversation. Just a quick word, I am going to ask everyone to keep your microphones on mute, at least, while we're working through it. But obviously, if you have questions, please feel free to either unmute yourself or to wave your hand, or if you know how to use the Zoom, raise your hand function, or to use the chat function as well. We want to try to make use of all of what we have to be able to take advantage of in terms of using Zoom. And with that, we are going to get started. So I want to begin with a note of acknowledgement and a disclaimer. Many of you may know the name Aaron Pankin, Rabbi Dr. Aaron Pankin, who was a professor and the president of the Hebrew Union College. He's of blessed memory, passed away tragically a few years ago. When Aaron was a professor, one of the classes that he taught was called 12 Tremendous Texts. And it was a class for rabbinic students in their later years in school. And so it was a way it was a deep dive into various stories that come from our tradition, including the story of Honi the Circlemaker, that really did what I think a lot of rabbis and professors and deeply engaged Jewish learners like to do, which is to take a story that we know the broad strokes of, really delve into what it's all about, take it apart, and then ultimately put it back together again. And so this was one of the texts that he taught in that class. It was done in one session or 1 week. And he also wrote a really, really well-researched in-depth paper. Anyone who knew Rabbi Pankin knew that everything he did was well-researched and in-depth. Wrote a paper called Telling Retellings, Honi the Circlemaker, and the Development of the Rabbinic Narrative Discourse. And I'll share that the paper was published posthumously last year in a book entitled From Scrolls to Traditions. And the research that he did, and especially the taking apart of the various textual sources around the story of Honi the Circlemaker, makes up the backbone of this class. And as I was taught in rabbinical school, Ha'omer davar b'shem omro mevi et geulat ha'olam. Anyone know what that means? It means someone who shares a teaching and does so by sharing the name of the teacher who taught that person that brings about the redemption of the world. In other words, cite your sources. It's a deeply held Jewish practice, a deeply held Jewish value to cite the sources and to name the teachers that taught you the wisdom you're going to share with others. And so in that vein, I wanted to share that about Dr. Pankin. And the second thing I want to share is about translations. Most of the translations we're going to look at are from Sepharia. The translation of the Babylonian Talmud from Sepharia is known as the William Davidson Talmud. It was a free digital edition of the Babylonian Talmud with parallel translations. And the translation was done by Rabbi Adin Evan Israel Steinsaltz, which is offered at Sefaria.com. You will note something, and I will point this out throughout most of the parts of the text. One of the things that Rabbi Steinsaltz did in his translation of the text was to show how terse the Talmudic text in particular is in the translation, only the words that actually appear in the text are in bold, and the words around that are not in bold are the words that the translator needs to make sure that they understand what the text is. Thank you, Dan. It's Sefaria.org, not Sefaria.com. You will see that change for next week's presentation, I can promise you. And with all of that, as we begin, and since we're going to spend most of the day learning text today, I do want to invite those to join me in the Bracha for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who has made us holy with your commandments and commands us to engage in words of Torah. And the first bit of Torah we're going to look at today is a video about Honi the Circlemaker. The video was put together many years ago by Godcast and Bim Bam, which is a great online resource for short videos about the Parshiot and about the holidays. Alan Harris, to your question, is this being recorded? It is being recorded. It's being live streamed and recorded, and will be available in posterity on our website and on our YouTube page. Speaking of YouTube, I'm going to stop this share and transition into a different share, a share of the video of Honi the Circlemaker. So stand by, hang on, I got to stop it. Share sound, share. Here we go. If you can't hear, wave your arms. Can you hear the video?
In the land of Israel, the winter season is the only time it rains. And that year, there was no rain.
I'm so thirsty. We haven't had water in weeks.
I'm so hungry and my crops are dead.
What should we do?
Let's ask Honi the Circlemaker for help.
What can I do you for?
There's no rain.
Our trees won't grow.
Stop kvetching. I know what to do. I'm going to pray. Hey, God! These people really need the rain. Please, send us some. How's it going?
Nothing yet.
Hello, God. These people really need the rain. We depend on it for everything. It waters the plants, it makes the trees grow, and the trees give us shelter, wood, nuts, and fruit. And, the people really haven't been taking many showers lately.
Show some respect. That's God you're talking to.
He is going to get so skewered.
And still nothing.
Come on, God. I'm not leaving this circle until it really rains.
Whoa!
Nice job, God. You rock.
Most people talk to God with respect.
But it's like they're talking to their dentist. Honi and God talk like they're best friends.
Okay, boss. Gotta go. What are you doing?
I'm planting a carob tree.
Why bother? That's gonna take forever.
70 years, actually.
Exactly. You won't even be around to taste it.
Maybe I won't, but my grandparents planted carob trees for me, so I'm planting trees for the next generation to come.
Okay.
That could have been the end of the story, but it isn't. For then, as the rabbis tell it, Honi fell asleep for 70 years.
Hey! Did you plant that tree?
My grandparents did.
Is the son of Honi the Circlemaker still around?
No, but I'm his grandson. You look a little wiped out. Here, snack on some carob.
Anyone see that video before? It's cute. David, you have? It's a cute video. It's a cute video, and it really captures the essence of the story of Honi the Circlemaker. Although, as we're going to learn over the next few weeks, the essences and the nuances simply cannot be captured in a 3.5-minute video that is designed for kids and for people who are learning the tradition. It's a really great resource. But as we're going to see, there's a lot to this story that lives just below the surface, especially when you delve into the texts. So my question for everybody is, what is the story of Honi the Circlemaker all about? Or asked another way, what is Honi? Who might he be? How might we describe who this guy Honi is? That's a question for which I'm hoping some of you might have an answer or an idea of an answer. David.
Well, my understanding from seeing this in the past and from studying Honi in the past is that he was kind of an enigma. He professed to be able to make it rain and got paid for doing it, by the way. You know, some of the rabbis were saying that you know, he was just being a charlatan and trying to be a thief. But I think in his heart and in his mind, he was convinced that by praying, he could actually do it. And, you know, of course, this is the original tale of Rip Van Winkle. And this is how the tale of Rip Van Winkle actually got started. So I've studied Honi quite a bit with people like Rabbi Miller and stuff. And it's a fantastic story, and it keeps on going on, and it gets deeper and deeper and deeper every time you listen to it.
Oh wait, just you wait, David, till we go deep. I mean, because we're gonna go back to its origins before it really got promulgated as the story that we know, to see how see the evolution of it from a kernel of an idea to the text in the Babylonian Talmud, which really forms our sort of the final version of the story. But there's so many pieces to there as well. But to answer my question, David, you mentioned he was a charlatan potentially, right? Or he was a pious person who believed deeply in the power of prayer.
That's right.
Or he was a person who was out to make some money, right? Which is neither good nor bad, right? A charlatan is a person who's there to take your money and not do what he says he's going to do. Or he was a person who had a skill. Other ideas, other ways you might describe who this guy Honi is based on what we know from the story of what he did.
He thought he had a good relationship with God.
He had a good relationship with God. You know, they mentioned, Steve, you're right, in the story that the people around him were taken aback by his comfort and his casualness with God, right? There was the comment, how can you speak to God like that? Most people speak so formal, and the woman said, yeah, you talk to God like you're talking to your dentist, right? Which did not seem to be particularly powerful. And if you want to really have a relationship with God, you got to be able to cut through that. On the other hand, could you potentially get too casual? And someone who speaks about God in that way is there's a very limited number of people in our tradition who have that interpersonal reactive relationship with God, where God asks of them and they can actually respond, or vice versa. Good. Other ideas? Bobby?
He was somebody that everybody else looked up to. That
So
they
a communal
trusted
leader
him.
at the same time.
You know, they trusted him to be able to communicate to God. Why they couldn't do it themselves, I don't know. So he must have been special.
He did something no one else could do. Now, you know, the interesting thing, just as a note, and we'll talk about this for a second, right? The way in which the biblical world judges whether or not someone is a true prophet is with a very simple question. Did their prophecies come true? Right? Honi was only effective because he was effective. If he wasn't effective, he wouldn't have been effective. Right? If God had not replied with the water and then turned the water off when it got to be too much, we might not have the story of Honi the Circlemaker, but we'll see. So just a couple of things that some of which we've discussed and some of which have not thrown out. So people talk about Honi as a martyr, as a prophet, as a magician or a miracle worker, as a deeply pious person, as a charismatic holy man, right? And that's that kind of that charlatan space that David mentioned, or as a devout man who simply used the power of prayer, right? And, you know, these descriptions also raise a fundamental question about the events in Honi the Circlemaker. And the fundamental question is this: who ultimately was responsible for the rains falling and the rains not falling?
God.
So God is the answer to that question, depending on how you look at the answer to the question, right? And I say that because if Honi was a magician, if Honi was a miracle worker, then it wasn't God, it was Honi. However, if it was not Honi, but instead it was God, then the question is who is doing it, right? If Honi is the pious man, he's the prophet, he's the devout man who prayed, then we're giving credit to God. But in that time period, in that place, right? And for those of us who are familiar with the biblical text, that's one of the tensions, right? Going all the way back to like the signs and portents and the plagues of Egypt, right? Who is doing this? Moses does this, and Pharaoh's holy men, his magic workers, recreate it. And so how you see who did this and where you see the hand of God, and as we look at various texts from different places in our tradition and one that's sort of quasi in our tradition, we can ask ourselves who's doing this, right? Now, when we get to the full story of Honi and the circle, he says, God, I'm not going to leave the circle until you make it rain. It's clear it's God. But earlier on, it's a little bit less clear potentially. All right. Still clearing the weeds to begin the story. The story of Honi and the Circlemaker does not begin in the Babylonian Talmud. Doesn't begin in the Jerusalem Talmud. Doesn't begin in the Mishnah. Doesn't begin in the Tosefta. It begins actually all the way back in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews. It's a very brief text that we're going to look at today. And the question of whether or not Josephus's Antiquities is a Jewish text or not is an interesting one. Because we know that for a while Josephus was kind of on Team Jewish. And then as the histories go, he was surrounded by the Romans. And when they offered him the chance to save his neck and join their team, he did that. But he speaks with a lot of authority, at least what passes for authority at that time period. Historically, he records a lot of what was going on in the Jewish world in the final few centuries before the Common Era in a way that nobody else did. And so we'll begin with him in the textual development, and we're going to see the through line from Josephus. Then we fast forward a couple of hundred years, and we have two more texts the Tosefta, and the Mishnah, right? Now, these texts are generally understood to be the bridge between the Judaism that was practiced at the temple with the sacrificial ritual and the sacrificial cult, and the bridge to what becomes known as Rabbinic Judaism. What goes on in that? Well, the rabbis ask themselves, how are we going to practice Judaism without there being a temple? And their big invention is that they're going to intercede to God, not by making physical offerings of animals or plants or bread, but through prayer, right? It obviously wasn't a new idea. There were people like this guy Honi, who had been recorded as to calling upon God with the power of the word and asking God to change what God was going to do on behalf of the people. Now, the Mishnah becomes the authoritative text of the period. The Mishnah was codified around the year 200 of the Common Era. So about 130 years after the destruction of the temple, about 1800 years ago, a little more than that. And the Mishnah creates a new set of texts for us to study. Before the Mishnah, we had the biblical text, the 5 books of Moses. We had the books of the prophets. We had the books of the writings. And the Mishnah reorganizes and lays it out topically, not chronologically, in different, what are called Sidarim, in different orders. And in that, each subheading was called, in Hebrew it's called a Masechet, or in Hebrew it's called, or in English called a tractate, which was subtopical. And interestingly, the Masechet, the tractate from which the story of Honi is found, is in Ta'anit. Anyone know what a Ta'anit means? It's a fast. It's a fast. Why would the story of Honi and the Circlemaker be in the conversation about fasts? Why would people do public fasts? Because it hadn't rained. Right, as we see in the chat, David is joining us from Las Vegas, where the water in Lake Mead is getting lower and lower and lower and lower. You need a Honi to bring some rain, for sure, no question about that. And what the ancient Jewish world, both the biblical and the early rabbinic world, might say is, let's have a public fast as a way to, as a community, intercess to the Holy One, asking that God bring the rains. Now, in the land of Israel, rains have a season. It rains in the winter. It's dry in the summer. Winter goes from Simchat Torah to the second day of Pesach, and summer goes from the second day of Pesach to Simchat Torah. Just a side note, extra credit question. If we begin to pray for the dew in the summer prayer on the second day of Pesach, wouldn't it make sense to have a balance in the calendar and to have the prayer for rains begin on the second day of Sukkot, exactly 6 months to the day from the second day of Pesach? Anyone know why we wait until the end, until we get to Simchat Torah, to begin our prayers for rain? Phyllis, I'll answer your question in 1 second. I see it. We wait.
You don't want it to rain.
What, Steve? Say it again.
You don't want it to rain during the holiday.
Right, we're about to spend 7 days sitting in the sukkah. We want it to be dry after the holiday, if you would please make it rain, which is why we hold on to the blessings for rain until Simchat Torah. So, Phyllis, to answer your question, is the Mishnah a book? The Mishnah is a collection of books, right? The Mishnah is a book in some of the way that the Torah is a book. The Mishnah has 63, I believe, individual, what are called in English tractates that are topical. There's one for Shabbat. There's one for Rosh Hashanah. There's one for Yom Kippur. There's one for Pesach. There's one about laws of capital punishments. There's Pirkei Avot, which we've been studying for those of us who are joining us on Friday evenings for Shabbat this month. Avot is one of the tractates. So there's subtopical, and then there's the larger topical, which is all of them. So the Mishnah is divided into 6 orders. One order of which is called Zmanim. Times of the year. And what are the various tractates? Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, Yoma, Yom Kippur, and Ta'anit, the occasions of fasts are in that as well. So that's the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first collected iteration of Rabbinic Judaism. The rabbi is describing how Judaism should be practiced in a post-temple world. And all of the things that you and I know about Judaism are explicated there, right? When to say the Shema in the morning, when to say the Shema in the evening, how you should hang your mezuzah on the doorpost, how to blow the shofar, how to do this, how many cups of wine for the Seder, how much, it's all begin there. So the Mishnah gets codified around the year 200. And for the next 300 or 400 or 500 years, the following generations of rabbis say, well, that's all well and good, but I have a question. What about this? Or what about that? Or what about this? Or what about that? And they collected a conversation of the rabbis who came after the Mishnah, tearing apart and putting back together the questions that they raised. And that becomes known as the Gemara. And the Mishnah and the Gemara together become known as the Talmud. Okay? However, there were statements, stories, conversations, opinions that are from the same generation of those who contributed to the Mishnah, but whose opinions and statements and stories were not recorded in the Mishnah. Some of them were recorded in a separate collection called the Tosefta, and some of them only appear as they re-enter the conversation as proof texts in the Talmud that is the response to the Mishnah. So in general, Mishnah and Tosefta are from about the same time period, although it's very, very difficult to know a given text from the Mishnah or the Talmud, the Mishnah or the Tosefta, which one was first and which one was second. And scholars have to use other texts and other texts and other skills. And I say this because we're going to look at a story of Honi from the Tosefta and the story of Honi in the Mishnah, different tellings of the same story, and have to figure out did one come before the other. And I'm going to make an argument, actually Rabbi Pink can make an argument as to why one was before the other, but I want you to think in general, Mishnah and Tosefta, same time period. One was codified as the official. The word Tosefta, the etymology of the word actually means like extras or add-ons or additionals. And the word plays out in a few places. So the Tosefta is this collection of extra Mishnaic thinking and opinions that survive into the Talmud and have also now been collected as their own collection of positions. You may have heard the word of the Tosafists, who were commentators on the Talmud later on. And in modern Hebrew, if you go get a sandwich or you go get a shawarma or a falafel, the Tosafot are the extras, the toppings, the things you put onto the sandwich to make it better, right? The additional things. Lehosif is to add on. So either great rabbinic insights and bitter pickles, all with one word. That's the beauty of modern Hebrew, is when they want a word for toppings, they delve into the Talmud to find the answer. So we have a telling of the story of Honi and Josephus. We have a telling of the story in the Tosefta. We have a telling of the story in the Mishnah. We have a telling of the story in the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud that was a little bit earlier and codified in the land of Israel. So a lot of similarities, a lot of differences between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is a story that we sort of take as our one that is authoritative. The Jerusalem Talmud spends a lot more time reacting and responding to the laws of agriculture in the land of Israel. Whole chapters, whole tractates from the Mishnah, the Babylonian Talmud chooses not to respond to. The Jerusalem Talmud does, because it had to do with living in the land of Israel. The rabbis who contributed to the Jerusalem Talmud lived in the land of Israel. The rabbis who contributed to the Babylonian Talmud, for the most part, did not. Where were they living? This is in the Jeopardy category of stupid answers. Where were the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud living? In Babylonia, right? And the laws of agriculture that we read in Torah only apply to the land of Israel and only apply to Jews who live in the land of Israel. Jews who live outside the land are not incumbent to follow the law. Those who are not Jewish who live on the land do not need to follow the law. Only Jews living on the land of Israel have to follow those laws. So the rabbis of the Jerusalem Talmud were much, much more interested in understanding the minutia and the picayune pieces of that law. The rabbis of Babylonia, a little bit less so. For a whole bunch of reasons, mostly having to do with the fact that it was later and it was diasporic, the Babylonian Talmud becomes the authoritative. All of this is meaningful. All of this is insightful. And the story of Honi, right, when I say authoritative, that usually means it helps us understand what the law is, right? What the halakha is. The story of Honi is not a particularly halachic law or a halachic story. It's not telling us how we're supposed to make matzah or how to prepare a talit or whether or not the food is kosher. It's a story that tells us how we should see the world. It's what's called in Hebrew agadah, a story. And so even though the Babylonian Talmud is more authoritative when it comes to stories, what does that even mean? Both stories are good. Both stories give us insight. And what's beautiful when you read a story, as we're going to do and look at various iterations, is comparing and contrasting what the authors in that place at that time thought was important versus not. And how they changed the story to make their point. Okay. What I would like to do is fairly quickly, without much conversation, read what becomes ultimately the story of Honi from the Babylonian Talmud, just to put us all on the same page. The 3-minute video isn't the whole story. We're going to read the text together, and then we're going to go back and look at Josephus and begin to do the compare and contrast between the earlier texts. And for this, because I'm sure you're sick of hearing my voice, I would like to ask for volunteers to read the text for the group. So is there a person who would agree to read this first slide? Anita, I see your hand up. Before we begin though, Anita, I want to point out something that I mentioned before. Can you all see how some of the text is bold and some of the text is not? Can we all see that? Okay. That is the result of the translation is done by Rabbi Steinsaltz, who was trying to show us how terse the Talmudic language is. So if I were to read this, just reading the words in the Talmud, it would go like this. An incident which sent Honi HaMa'agel. The sages taught once most of Adar had passed, but rain had not fallen. They sent to Honi HaMa'agel, pray and rain will fall. He prayed, but no rain fell. He drew a circle, stood inside it in the manner of the prophet Habakkuk. As it is stated, I will stand upon my watch and set myself upon the tower. You can see all of the additional text that Rabbi Steinsaltz add for our own edification. And we will hear it now from the dulcet tunes of Anita Eidenberg.
The Mishnah taught, an incident occurred in which the people sent a message to Honi HaMa'agel. This event is related in greater detail in the following Barita. The sages taught, once, most of the month of Adar had passed, but rain had still not fallen. They sent this message to Honi HaMa'agel, pray, and the rain will fall. He prayed, but no rain fell. He drew a circle in the dust and stood inside it, in the manner that the prophet Habakkuk did, as it is stated, and I will stand upon my watch and set myself upon the tower, and I will look out to see what he will say to me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. Habakkuk 2:1. This verse is taken to mean that Habakkuk fashioned a kind of prison for himself where he sat.
Okay, so this is the beginning of the story. A few pieces we want to make sure that we understand, right? We see the typical formula in the Talmud. It begins with the Mishnah. There's a story in the Mishnah about the story. They sent a message to Honi HaMa'agel. right? An egel is a circle, the circle maker. The sages, and then it's related in greater detail in a baraita. So what is a baraita? This is an important word to know. Remember how I said before that there were certain pieces of the Tosefta that were reintroduced into the Talmudic text? That's when it says, well, that's what a baraita is. A baraita is a teaching from the time of the Mishnah that isn't in the Mishnah, that the rabbis of the Talmud say, here's another thing that we know from that time period that we're bringing back. Now, most baraitot can be found in the Tosefta, but not all of them. And as we will see, the Babylonian Talmud gives all this information about the baraita when the baraita itself is like this long, right? The teaching from the Tosefta upon which is based. So the rabbis are playing a little bit fast and loose, trying to give some authority to this statement. Now, the last thing I want to point out before we go forward, what does it mean when it says most of the month of Adar had passed, but still rain had not fallen? Why is that problematic?
Because there will be dry season after that.
Yeah. The month of Adar is the month of Purim, the month before Passover. It should have been raining all winter long, from the middle of Tishrei through Cheshvan, through Kislev, right? All the way through Adar into the first few weeks of Nisan. But they have gotten through the entire winter. They're a few weeks away from stopping the prayer for rain, the end of the rainy season, and it has still not rained at all. And so they were worried. Okay. Moving forward, who would like to read the next slide? I'm going to start calling on people. Go ahead, Phyllis. Lorraine, I saw you next.
Honi said before God, Master of the universe, your children have turned their faces toward me as I am like a member of your household. Therefore, I take an oath by your great name that I will not move from here until you have mercy upon your children and answer their prayers for rain. Rain began to trickle down, but only in small droplets. His students said to him, Rabbi, we have seen that you can perform great wonders, but this quantity of rain is not enough to ensure that we will not die. It appears to us that a small amount of rain is falling only to enable you to dissolve your oath, but it is not nearly enough to save us.
Thank you, Phyllis. Lorraine, keep going.
Okay. Honi said to God.
No, Phyllis, I'm sorry. Lorraine was going to read next, I think.
Okay.
That's okay.
Fine.
Lorraine or Howard, you got to unmute the microphone though so we can hear you. All right. If it's okay, Lorraine, why don't you work on that? I'll get someone else to read the next one and we'll come back to you. Someone else want to go? Go ahead, Bobby.
Honi said to God, I did not ask for this, but for rain to fill the cisterns, ditches, and caves. Rain began to fall furiously until each and every drop was as big as the mouth of a barrel, and the sages estimated that no drop was less than a log in size. His students said to him, Rabbi, we have seen that you can call on God to perform miracles and we will not die, but now it appears to us that rain is falling only to destroy the world. Honi said again before God, I did not ask for this harmful rain either, but for rain of benevolence, blessing, and generosity. Subsequently, the rains fell in their standard manner until all of the people sought higher ground and ascended to the Temple Mount due to the rain. They said to him, Rabbi, just as you prayed that the rain should fall, so too pray that they should stop. He said to them, this is the tradition that I received. that one does not pray over an excess of good.
Thank you.
Okay,
Lorraine,
I think, can you hear me?
we can, yeah.
Okay, great. However, what can I do to you as you nag God and he does your bidding? Like his father and his father does his bidding. And the son says to his father, Father, bathe in hot water, wash me with cold water, give me nuts, almonds, peaches, pomegranates. And his father gave him. About you, the verse states, your father will be glad and she who bore you will rejoice. The sages taught. What message did the members of the chamber of Hugh something great Sanhedrin send to Honi? Hame Agai. About you, the verse states, you should matter and shall be established for you, and the light shall shine upon your I don't know what that means. Upon your something cast down, you will say. There is lifting up, for he saves the humble person. He wants who is not innocent, and he will be delivered through the cleanness of your hand.
Thank you, Lorraine. Lorraine, I'm wondering if part of your screen is cut off.
It is.
You were losing the last line of a few words there.
Yeah.
I got to say, for the first paragraph, like, for those of us who are parents who have children who nag us from time to time, right? This part of the story reminded me of my children who refused to get into the bathtub and refused to get out. They refuse to go in the pool. They refuse to get out, right? They don't want to change, right? So you can nag God, right? The son who nags his father, I want a warm bath. I want a cold bath. I want. But the parents always give, because we parents, we give. And then in the second part, just a little bit of context. So the chamber of the hewn stone, the great Sanhedrin, this is like the leadership of the people, right? So it's like the political religious authority of the Jewish community, right? They say, okay, Honi, you took care of it for us. Good. All right. Julian, we will come back to the question of the hewn stone later. We're just reading through this text the first time now, because we're going to see the development of that group of people over the textual history. But it's a great question, and thank you for asking it. Someone want to read the last bit of the story for us?
Read it.
Some other volunteers? Brian, or Steve, go ahead. Go ahead, Steve. Thank you.
They interpreted, you shall also decree a matter. You, Honi, decree from below, and the Holy One, blessed be he, fulfills your statement from above. And the light shall shine upon your ways. A generation that was in darkness, you have illuminated it with your prayer. When they cast down, you will say, there is lifting up. A generation that was cast down, you lifted it up with your prayer. For he saves the humble person, a generation that was humble in its transgression. You saved it through your prayer. He will deliver the one who was not innocent. A generation that was not innocent, you have delivered it through your prayer. And he will be delivered through the cleanliness of your hands. You have delivered an undeserving generation through the clean work of your hands.
So this part of the story ends, and I know there's more to the story. We'll get there in a few weeks, but the rain part of the story ends here with a great celebration of what Honi has accomplished, right? And if we quickly go back, and I'll just summarize a few pieces. So Honi is called upon to ask for rain because there wasn't enough rain. He says he prayed, nothing happened. Then he draws the circle and says to God, like Habakkuk, I'm not leaving this circle till you give me what we need. And Habakkuk had done the same, and it was successful. Some rain began to fall down, a little bit of rain, a little bit. And the people said, Honi, you can't get off that easy, right? That's not enough rain for us. You didn't really do anything with that. And so he went back and he said, God, I need some more. And it rained 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 and it rained. So much that it was too much. And Honi had to go back and ask for it to stop. But what's interesting is, how does the text refer to Honi, particularly on this slide? How did the people address Honi? Mr. Circleman? His students said to him, Rabbi. Keep that in mind as we go back and look at the more ancient texts of whether Honi was in fact a rabbi. Or maybe there was someone else who wanted him to be a rabbi. And then we're celebrating how all the great things that Honi was able to accomplish for the people. Okay. Without spending too much time taking it apart, because what we're going to do is we're going to read this again in a few weeks with a lot more backstory and really take it apart word for word and verse for verse and phrase for phrase as we need to. And we'll have a better understanding. Do people get a sense of the broad strokes of the story as presented in the Babylonian Talmud? Great. Okay. Now we're going back. We are rewinding the tape nearly 1,000 years, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years, depending on, for what the textual tradition will suggest is the origin story of Honi the Circlemaker, the first iteration of the story. I'm going to read it. It's a little complicated, and so because I've read it a few times already, I'll spare everyone the teeth breaking of this exercise. Now there was one whose name was Onias. A righteous man he was, and a beloved of God, who in a certain drought had prayed to God to put an end to the intense heat, and whose prayers God had heard and had sent them rain. This man had hid himself because he saw that this sedition would last a great while. However, they brought him to the Jewish camp and desired that, as by his prayers he had once put an end to the drought, he would in like manner make imprecations on Aristobulus and those of his faction. And when upon his refusal and the excuses that he made, he was still by the multitude compelled to speak, he stood up in the midst of them and said, O God, King of the world, Ribono shel olam, since those who stand now with me are thy people, and those who are besieged are also thy priests, I beseech thee that thou wilt neither hearken to the prayers of those against these, nor bring to effect what these pray against those. Whereupon such wicked Jews as stood about him, as he made his prayer, stoned him to death. But God punished them immediately for their barbarity, and took vengeance of them for the murder of Onias in the following manner. When the priest and Aristobulus were besieged, it happened that a feast called the Passover was come, at which it is our custom to offer a great number of sacrifices to God. But those that are with Aristobulus wanted sacrifices and desired that their countrymen would without furnish them with such sacrifices, and assured them that they should have as much money for them as they should desire. And when they required them to pay 1,000 drachmae for each head of cattle, Aristobulus and the priests willingly undertook pay for them accordingly. And those within let down the money over the walls and gave it to them. But when others had received it, they did not deliver the sacrifices. And when the priests found that they had been cheated, they prayed to God that he would avenge them on their countrymen. Nor did he delay that their punishment be, but sent a strong and vehement storm of wind that destroyed the fruits of the whole country, till a modius of wheat was then bought for 11 drachmae. That's a little bit of a different story. A little bit of a different story. But what are the similarities? what do we see in both tellings of the story?
There was a drought.
So there was a drought, right? There was not enough rain. Good. What else?
They called on someone to appeal to God to fix it.
A man who had the power to appeal to God, who had the audacity to appeal to God, would appeal to God and ask for rain. What else?
It actually rained.
It rained. How much?
Not a lot.
Not at first, but then what?
Too much.
Too much. First, not enough, and then too much. And one other piece. When did this take place? When in the calendar? Near Passover. In that same transitional season from the end of the rainy season to the start of the dry season. I don't think I need to ask it, but I will point it out. What's the big difference between the Josephus story and the story in the Babylonian Talmud? Anita?
They killed him.
Yeah, they killed Honi. They killed Honi. You shouldn't kill Honi. He's a nice guy. But they killed Honi. Right? And it's also not entirely clear who did. Right? That there's another group of people in the story. There's the other people of the time. Right? The Greeks. Who, there's a separation between the people who are the people and the Jews. Right? In the Babylonian text, we are the people. In the Josephus text, there's the Jews and then there's other people, right? I should just point out that Onias is just sort of a Hellenization of Honi, right? You have the O, the N, the I, add the S on the end, so it sounds like it's Greek, right? I don't speak Greek, but it sounds like it. So there are some similarities there, but also we see that the story is so much less developed, right? It's sort of just large plot points, not a whole lot of dialogue in between. When we get to the Babylonian text, there's so much more in there, right? This reads like minutes. So he did that, and he did that, and he did that, and then they killed him, and then it rained, and then it rained too much. So that is the story in Josephus, not so much to play with. There's also this squabble that's going on among the political leadership at the time, right? That it seems like Honi is caught in a crossfire between the Greek authorities and the Greek folks and the Greek authorities and the Jewish folks and the Jewish folks and their own authority, right? What, Anita?
Nothing.
Does that theme ring a bell with anyone? Of a story of our people that took place where we got caught in a crossfire between political leaders that we were not necessarily beholden to? Maybe from ancient Greece? Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Thank you, Julian. Hanukkah, exactly. Right? The Hanukkah story the rabbis tell is the story of the righteous Jews fighting back against the wicked Greeks. If you read Josephus, if you read other texts from the time period, it suggests that it was much, much less one-dimensional and much more multidimensional. That you had some Jews who were on the side of the Hellenizers, and you had some Jews who were not. You had the Greeks who were more interested in peace and quiet than they were in privileging one group or another. And yeah, the nuance that was necessary was significantly more. But we see a similar part of the story where when we get to the rabbinic period, everything is about the Jews. The Jews are all on the same side, and they're all working together, and they're all working with God. Whereas in the contemporary text of the Greek period, it seems like the rabbis are de-emphasizing the things that they don't want us to focus on, like separate differences between the Jewish people. And they're hyper-emphasizing that they want us to think the Jews worked together. They were all very pious. They listened to God. They prayed to God. God did. And they don't want us to think differently about the community. Now, we can debate whether or not Josephus is a Jewish text, right? It's certainly not a holy text in the way that we would call Tanakh or Mishnah or Tosefta or Talmud holy. But whether or not it's Jewish is an interesting debate. In the same way that I would say that, all the rabbis today who are writing Divrei Torah and writing books, right? Those are not holy books, but they're Jewish books. Not clear whether or not Josephus is a Jewish book, right? To use another, an interesting thing that a lot of folks like to do today, they might look at the writings of a prominent Jew in the secular world and say, does this book reflect their Judaism, right? Do the legal opinions of the late Justice Ginsburg, may her memory be a blessing, are her opinions reflective of her Judaism? And should we consider her opinions Jewish thoughts? Well, you could make an argument. At certain points, yes. At certain points, no. But certainly not holy text, but certainly also inspired by Judaism. Josephus, as a historian of his time, inspired by Jewish background, but unclear who he's writing for and who he's writing to. And that changes as his story continues. All right. We have a few minutes left. And so I'm going to introduce us to the first rabbinic telling of the story of Honi. And that would be from the Tosefta. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the dating of the Tosefta and the Mishnah together is simple. They are from the first few centuries. But to know whether a parallel text from the Tosefta comes before or after the Mishnah that tells the same story can be difficult. Rabbi Pankin in his article said, in this instance, though, he's convinced it's clear that the Tosefta text came first. It's simpler, it's shorter, it's less embellished, as we'll see next week, and therefore he presumes that it came earlier. You are looking at the entirety of the story of Honi the Circlemaker in the Tosefta. It's just these few sentences. A story of one chassid, that they say to him, pray and rains will fall. He prayed and rains fell. They say to him, just as you have prayed and rains fell, typo on my part, pray that they will go. He said to them, go out and see if a person can stand on the Karen Ophel and rinse his foot in the Kidron River. Meaning, can you go on top of the mountain and wash your feet in the river because so much rains have filled up? And when that's happened, there's enough rain. We pray that rains will not fall, but are sure that God is not bringing a flood ever again. As it says, never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth, in the story of Noah and the ark. And it says, for this to me is like the waters of Noah. As I swore the waters of Noah would never more flood the earth, so I will swear I will not be angry with you or rebuke you. That's it. That's the entirety of the story of Honi the Circlemaker as told in the Tosefta, the shortest and tersest telling of them all. Having read briefly, quickly, the Talmudic text from the Babylonian and read the Josephus text, we'll pick up here, but just on first reading, what are some things that jump out to you as similarities and differences between the two, between the three? Bobby, go ahead.
Well, God listened in all the texts. It was how little or how much he gave in response, but he listened.
Yeah. God listened, turned on the rain, and then God turned off the rain when God was asked to. Yeah. Thank you, Dan. We'll see you next week. Thanks for your comment, by the way. There's a question in the chat. A foot on both mountains land is a centrist, more centrist initially in the text. So the metaphor or the image that the Tosefta is trying to create is that you can stand on the mountain and wash your feet in the river because so much water has filled the, if you're imagining, we're talking about Lake Mead before in Las Vegas, imagine you're at the Grand Canyon, right? At the base of the Grand Canyon is the Colorado River. So imagine there's so much water that you can stand outside the Grand Canyon on like the ridge and wash your feet in the Colorado River. That's how much rain came up. Sivan asks, why would you characterize it as magic rather than as a prayer that is answered? As a prayer by someone who is dear to God. So that's the really interesting question, Sivan, that we'll pick up with next week. But it all has to do with how you understand the relationship between Honi and God, right? So for example, we see in the later text that there is a back and forth between God and Honi. In the Tosefta, he prayed for rains and rain fell. And so God is one step removed from the story here than God is in the Babylonian Talmud. And so in the biblical world, the ancient world, the wondering of who was actually causing it to rain. The person who said it's going to rain or the God above that you can't see was a question mark. And that is where we'll pick up at our conversation next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Very
Thanks.
interesting.
Oh, I wasn't sharing the text from Tosefta. You didn't tell me. I had it. I could have brought it up. You didn't remind me you couldn't see the text. Next time I forget the text, say we can't see the text. I'll share the text. There's the text. We'll see you next week. I work hard on these slides. Thanks, everyone.